So as people jump on the call, I'll just explain how we typically do this.
Yeah.
Um, you and I will talk about the essay and some related themes for, I don't know, 35, 40 minutes as we chat. Hopefully, it will provoke questions in the minds of our participants. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. So as questions occur to you, pop them into the Q&A. Yuval, I know, is no shrinking violet when it comes to tough questions. So um, not only do I encourage people to ask hard questions, but I will look for the hardest questions, so long as they're within the bounds of good taste. So ask away. Anyway, Yuval, thank you. You contributed an essay which we called "The Trust Trap" for our summer issue. It's an issue that is about faith, but faith in institutions is every bit as essential to the well-being of a good society as faith in other things, higher powers, moral codes, and so on. And you begin with by just glancingly referencing a poll or an annual poll that the Gallup organization has been conducting since the early 1970s, which is called Confidence in Institutions. And I just wanted to go over some of the points in the confidence in institutions poll to give our participants a sense of just how precipitous, dramatic the decline in confidence in institutions has been in our lifetimes, actually in just this century. In 2001, at the beginning of the century, Americans expressed either a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the church or organized religion, 60%. It is now barely half that, 32%. Let's see, in public schools, it was, well, here it hasn't gone down too far, 38% down to 29%. Newspapers, my institution, at the beginning of the century, 36% expressed a great deal of confidence. This year, half as many, or 18%. Congress, never very popular, but more astonishingly unpopular than ever, 26% down to 9%. TV news, 30, and this is we're also seeing this in academic settings, which were one of the pillars of American confidence up until fairly recently, up until about 10 years ago. And there it's declining dramatically as well. And so the first question that I want to ask Yuval is, why is this happening? Is this a function of Americans becoming a more cynical nation, or of institutions becoming simply less trustworthy, or some combination of the two?
It's a wonderful way to put the question, and thank you, Bret, for this opportunity and for the chance to write the essay too. The striking thing about that data is the breadth of it, more than the depth of it. That is, you can tell a story about each of those institutions. Certain things have happened with the popular press and stories around the New York Times, or whatever you want to say. Certain things have happened about faith in the Catholic Church, or specific reasons for that. But when you step back and see that we've seen a precipitous decline in trust in institutions across that range, everywhere you look, really all institutions except for local government and the military are less popular now than they were a generation ago and 2 generations ago. Then you see that we really do have something to understand here about the direction of American society and American culture. One thing to understand about it is that Americans came down from very great heights of trust in institutions in the middle of the 20th century. So By the end of the 1960s, trust in institutions was bizarrely high in the United States. And that's because of World War II and mobilization through two depressions. And Americans really had a lot of trust in leaders and institutions. That starts to fall by the 1970s, and that fall accelerated beginning in 2000 or so and throughout the 21st century. I think that there are two phases there, and that the decline of trust that we saw in the 1970s and 80s was a kind of disillusionment, a sense that the institutions that seemed to be capable of doing anything in the middle of the 20th century were just run by human beings, and you see a gradual decline throughout. In the 21st century, I really do think we've seen something different. We're living in a populist era where confidence in elites of all sorts, including the people who run institutions, has been plummeting unremittingly for now the last 25 years. And I do think that to understand that, we have to actually dig a little bit into this peculiar thing we call trust in institutions, right? What really is an institution? What kind of a thing is that to have faith or trust in? And ultimately, an institution is a collection of people organized around a purpose. And that purpose gives each of them a role, a specific task and role in relation to the others, in relation to the institution itself. And I think a lot of the loss of confidence in institutions in the 21st century has been a sense that what people are doing in a lot of our elite institutions is not what their role is. It's not that they're incompetent, it's that they're not performing the role assigned to them by the institution, and therefore they're not constrained by the institution. And in that sense, constraint is an unusually important facet of what it takes to be trusted. That's really become important for us to see in the 21st century. We trust people not only when they can do the job they claim to be able to do, but also when they're constrained. When someone doesn't trust the police, it's because they think the police won't stop. There's nothing they won't do to them. When someone doesn't trust a political leader now, a lot of it is about a sense that this person is unconstrained rather than incompetent. And that's been very difficult for the leaders of a lot of our institutions to understand. And so in some ways, they've made things worse in the process of trying to make them better.
Let me just challenge you a little bit, because it's often the simplest explanations are the most persuasive ones. And let's take an institution, the IRS. The IRS, I read recently, answers about 10% of calls made to it. It more or less performs the same function it always has. It collects our taxes, but its performance has been dismal. The institutes of health, the CDC, the various institutes around public health, did not perform very well during the COVID crisis. They offered advice which turned out to be baseless or unscientific. They were slow to roll out testing regimes. I mean, one can criticize them in many ways. Public schools in the United States are graduating a high percentage, if not a majority, of students who cannot adequately perform the tasks expected of fifth graders, ninth graders, 12th graders, and so on. So why shouldn't we just simply look at this as a performance issue, whereas what you seem to be suggesting is that it's more than that, it's like a values issue?
I think a lot of the collapse in trust in the IRS, for example, has been a function of the sense that it's become politicized under different presidents, that the job it's doing is not its job of collecting income taxes. Most Americans never call the IRS, and the reason they don't trust the institution is not that they tried to interact with it and it seemed incompetent. The reason, I think, has more to do with the ways in which, under both President Obama and then President Trump, the IRS seemed to be doing the political bidding of elected officials rather than its kind of technical job. The CDC, of course, is a complicated story. There's definitely, and I would say in general, there have been failures of competence in 21st century institutions. You would think about the intelligence community and the Iraq War or 9/11. You think about the banking system and the regulators around the financial crisis and public health around COVID. It's not as though there haven't been reasons to lose confidence in their competence. But even if you think about public health, a lot of what concerned people in the wake of the COVID pandemic was that public health officials seemed to be playing games with them. We're not honest with them. We're trying to manipulate them into doing various things. Making claims about what masks could do so that you could save masks for public for healthcare workers, and then trying to drive people to behave this way or that, rather than just being upfront about what they know and what they can do. So it is a combination, but I think that the way in which the loss of confidence in institution interacts with the overwhelming populism of this period in American life is that people have a sense that those who are in charge of many of our leading institutions are using those institutions as political platforms, as ways of enabling themselves to be players in the theater of our national politics, rather than just doing the core job that is expected of them. And so it isn't just that people think they're not doing that job well enough. A lot of times, populism actually has too high an opinion of how well elites do their jobs. The worry is that they're out for themselves, or that they're
Too
advancing
high in the sense that populists imagine that we elites are competent creatures who can manipulate markets and
there's this conspiracy and everybody's working behind the scenes. I mean, having worked at the White House, having worked for members of Congress, nobody's working behind the scenes. People are trying to, survive the afternoon. Conspiracies are not right because they overestimate the competence of the people involved. But I think a lot of times the underlying assumption there is an assumption about their motives, which is very important to that loss of trust and very hard to overcome.
This is what you call in your essay a crisis of elite legitimacy. This is what you are describing, and this crisis has led to a revolt of the masses, so to speak, a populist revolt. But I want to ask you about the nature of this populist revolt, because your thesis, I gather, as I understand it, is too many institutional leaders, whether it's Anthony Fauci or the president of a major university, are acting outside their lane, right? We want to go to a hospital to get a medical opinion. We don't want to see someone wearing a political flag on their lapel, for example. They're going and this is I think you're absolutely right that people feel like they are being lectured to by experts who have no expertise in the field of politics. But then comes the question of the populist revolt, and here I'm not sure. I'd like you to persuade me of your thesis, because let's take Donald Trump and the MAGA movement is the populist revolt we're thinking about, and Trump very recently has talked about more political control over the Federal Reserve, right? Trump does not seem to be a guy who has ever driven in his own lane in life, right? And much of what populism is the opposite of restraint. They're not asking for less government. They're actually, in many cases, asking for more government. They're not asking for minimalism. They're actually asking for a kind of political maximalism. At least some voices within the movement do that. It's cacophonous. So how do you explain the populist revolt in light of this sense that you have that the essence of the problem is that too many people have overstepped their bounds?
It's a great question. What I offer here is not a defense of populism. It is a partial explanation, I think, of the motives underlying it. But I certainly think that the nature of the populist reaction to this kind of loss of trust has exacerbated the problem, has been an example of the problem as much as it's been an answer to it. So let me speak to a couple of the elements of what you raised. First of all, I think the sense that loss of trust results from people acting outside of their sphere, outside of their lane, is very important to understand. I always think in this context about that line of Michael Jordan's in the 1990s when he was asked to make an ad for a Senate candidate in North Carolina. And he said offhandedly, and a reporter heard him and it got him in trouble. He said, I don't want to do it because Republicans buy sneakers too. That seems like almost cynical. It seems offhanded, but when you actually think about what he was saying, and this is really, he was asked about this in the ESPN documentary he made about him called The Last Dance, which was really wonderful. And he said, look, I'm not a politician, and I don't want people to have to decide whether they're going to be Bulls fans by whether they're Democrats or Republicans. And that's actually a profound insight into a lot of what has gone wrong in contemporary American political and cultural life, that we're constantly asked to make decisions in our lives based on partisan allegiance when that should have nothing to do with what's being taken up. It just shouldn't matter what the phone company thinks about abortion. It's not right that it matters what Major League Baseball thinks about some election law in Georgia. We've got to give people room to have things in common, even when they don't have politics in common. Otherwise, American life becomes impossible. And one of the things that becomes impossible is trust, because at that point, you look out on American society and it's full of friends and enemies. That's all it is. It's your team and the other team. And it becomes impossible to trust people as professionals. I think that's part of what has been motivating a kind of populist mistrust of a lot of elites, because the American elite now is just simply more cohesive than it's ever been. The United States used to stand out, especially in the 19th century. When you read European visitors to the United States, Americans had multiple elites. The people who ran companies were actually very different from the people who ran universities and from the people who ran government offices. They had different educations, different cultural affinities, different kinds of political background. Those people now are almost perfectly interchangeable. They all went to the same 5% or so of top universities. They're very culturally similar. A Wall Street banker and a bureaucrat and a person who runs a Hollywood studio and somebody who runs a major newspaper, they're very similar. And that means that there is now an elite for the American public to react against in a very distinct way. There's an up-down politics at least as strong as the left-right politics. And the up-down politics is not a healthy politics. The populist reaction, as you say, is not a kind of analysis of these sources of mistrust that tries somehow to correct them. It's an equal and opposite distortion. And I absolutely think that part of what the Trump movement has done is try to politicize life further so that we come more to think that all there is us and them, all there is Team A and Team B, and there's no escape from it, no way out. I think the populist reaction more generally makes it impossible to have the kind of confidence and expertise that a modern society at some level has to have. Tony Fauci made himself hard to trust. Donald Trump made it harder to trust Tony Fauci. But we actually do need somebody who knows more than the average person about public health in a crisis. And so there has to be some capacity to trust. And in order to do that, both experts and the general public have responsibilities. Experts do have to be restrained and not speak too far beyond their domain. And the public really does have to be willing to acknowledge that there are some people who know more than the rest of us about different domains. Every one of us knows more than most people about something. And so we have to have some room to allow authority to have a place in our life and to allow especially expertise to have a place in our lives. That becomes much more difficult in a populist moment like this.
Let me read something you write in your essay, which I found really fascinating. You write, so how do our own elites now justify their status and that of the institutions they lead? Implicitly, without ever quite articulating it, they tend to fall upon a mix of technocratic credentials and progressive high-mindedness. This broadly describes the self-image of the unusually cohesive elite class that now runs most of our major institutions. And you go on to note that the hallmark of, say, a modern university leader is PhDs from elite institutions, citations in books, and then as you put it, naming Native American tribes that once occupied the land that is now Harvard as a kind of a way of expiating a sense of sin. When you think about those two pieces of the equation, technocratic credentials and progressive high-mindedness, I can understand how progressive high-mindedness infuriates, for cultural reasons, a broad segment of the public. But I'd like you to expand a little bit on the question of technocratic credentials as, I think, a increasingly insufficient process by which an elite can legitimize itself.
Right. So I think insufficient is exactly the right word. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And so when someone wants to claim some authority or expertise, we certainly do want to know that there's some reason to believe they know the subject. But we also need to know something else. We need to know that they can be trusted with power. And that requires some evidence of what we might have called character in the past, but what we can even just call restraint, responsibility. Oftentimes, that's achieved by institutional forms. So if you think about why you trust a journalist, some of that may have to do with their education, but really not necessarily. Journalists work through a process of verification and editing and layers of fact checking.
Some of us do. Let's put it that way.
Ideally, right? Yeah, yeah. And the reason that they're trusted is that process, right? That's why you would believe what they say. Or an accountant is ultimately answerable to a professional code. And when they do things that are not allowed in that code, they lose their license. And we trust them in part because that code restrains them. When we can no longer see those restraints, when that code doesn't restrain them. So for a journalist, when someone just steps outside of the bounds of that profession and presents their views on Twitter, they're just another person on Twitter, and they no longer have recourse to the sources of trust that are made possible by professional institutions. And when that happens in the professions in general, and when it happens in corporate America, and when it happens elsewhere, it becomes very difficult for us to have the kind of confidence we need to have in people that we assign power to. We need to know that professionals and leaders and experts are at some level working in the interest of the public, that they are our agents in some particular domain. And when they don't show us that anymore, to show us how competent they are, how many degrees they have, is not going to fill that gap. And to try to address the kind of guilt they have about the authority and power and wealth they have in our society by basically talking down our society and talking about how terrible its history is, certainly won't help. And so they need to see that what it would take to recover some of that trust is evidence that they are in fact constrained by the institutions that they are part of. I think that is now very difficult for a lot of people in a lot of American institutions because we all want to be individual performers in American public life, even when our jobs really require being subjected to a professional ethos.
So, if you go back to an era of very high trust in American institutions, let's say the time of the Kennedy administration, what you will in fact find, or what a historian would, I think an impartial historian will tell us, is that many of those institutions were in fact operating in dangerously unconstrained ways. Many of our leaders were behind the veil, violating the trust of the American people. The real difference is that back then we lived in an era of concealment, and now we live in an era of radical, relentless, almost pornographic transparency. And what do I have in mind? In 1960, I think it's inarguable, the Democratic machine in Chicago stole the election for Jack Kennedy. It would have been won otherwise by Richard Nixon, who knew it, and actually, to his great credit he rarely gets, refused to contest the election. J. Edgar Hoover was spying on Americans whose politics he didn't like in a way that would absolutely shock us now. When Kennedy became president, he presented an image of a happy, a very Catholic family. Reality was, shall we say, otherwise, and so on. And what has taken place over the last 60 odd years isn't necessarily that people have become less trustworthy, institutions or institutional leaders don't stay in their lanes. We have simply just removed the veil. And when you remove the veil, it turns out the bodies are a great deal uglier than they might otherwise appear. And so I guess I'm asking this to say, if there's a way of restoring trust, wouldn't it begin with not so much trying to reform institutions or create new ethics, but simply being a little restrained in terms of what we choose to see? That is I'm now kind of, I want us to turn to thinking about solutions, that the real problem is simply that we see too much and we need to teach ourselves to look for less.
Well, I think that's true in part. I would say a few things about this. The story of the United States in the post-World War II decades is in a lot of ways a story of spending capital amassed in the previous 2 or 3 decades, spending social capital of all kinds. And the way in which that was amassed, the way in which that trust in leaders and institutions was built, was actually rooted in a huge amount of common sacrifice, especially wartime sacrifice, but in some ways mobilization even before that. There was a sense that Americans were all in it together. And so there was just much less of a kind of up and down politics than not only than we have now, but than there normally has been in the United States. And more trust in leaders and in institutions than there normally has been in the United States. I don't think that was the optimal level of trust in leaders. I think Americans had way too much trust in their leaders in the early 1960s, and that trust did real damage. It is necessary to approach people in power with some suspicion, though I think we've vastly overdone that now to the point where our politics can't really function. So how do you find that better balance? I would say that from where we are, part of the answer does involve allowing institutions to have more of an interior life, so that some of what happens inside institutions really doesn't belong in the public square in the way that it's now. Internal debates within a newspaper, internal debates within a corporation, internal debates within a university department, all those now are public. They're all on Twitter, they're all the time. That should not happen. And that is bad for trust in that institution. It's also bad for the functioning of it. I would say maybe the prime example of this is the dysfunction that we see in the United States Congress. Transparency is very important in institutions populated by elected officials, and we do need to know what they do on our behalf. And yet, there also need to be some protected spaces for bargaining and negotiation, which cannot happen in public. There's no way that you can make a deal in public. It can't work. It never does. In fact, it doesn't now. If you think about when Congress does legislate, it legislates at midnight before a government shutdown in the leadership offices, because those are places where there aren't cameras. And if there were more places where there aren't cameras, where members can engage with each other, Congress would function better. I think transparency has gone too far in that institution. There are other instances where it has, but I guess I wouldn't say that's the primary driver of the loss of trust we've seen. And I don't think that it's the first and foremost way in which we can rebuild that trust. I think a concern for institutional responsibility, the basic question, given the role that I have here, what should I be doing, is a question that we have to ask. The role might be that you're a CEO or an employee or a teacher or a priest. Given that role, what should I do in this situation is a question we just have to ask more than we do. I think a lot of the people who now most drive us crazy in American life are people who just seem not to ask that question. You wonder, how could he have done that? He's the president, or he's a priest. The failure to ask that question, the people we do trust now are people who seem to ask that question and who place some constraints on themselves. And maybe it's mostly appearances. Okay, that's fine. I think pretending to be a good person is still better than not. And it's very important that people feel some pressure to practice the behavior that's expected of them in the roles they have in their lives. And there's just not enough of that in this moment in American life, and it becomes very hard to trust each other.
And there's this larger cultural question about the valorization of shamelessness in many spheres of life, including politics. In fact, one of the paradoxes of politics is that any normal person who would have reason to be embarrassed about one or two things in their life, but is otherwise an upstanding person, will not want to go into politics because they don't want to deal with something in their past. But the people who will deal with it are either people who are the handful of people who are, you might say, morally stainless, the Mitt Romneys of the world, and then you have the morally shameless, like they just don't care. They are indifferent to what you think. This goes beyond the scope of your essay, Yuval, but maybe I can push you, because trust is not just the trust crisis is not just an American phenomenon. Frank Fukuyama wrote a book, which I'm sure you're familiar with, many years ago about trust. He did a lot of important social science work, kind of looking at different societies and noting that low trust societies, whether it's Lebanon or Brazil, tend to be unsuccessful societies. High trust societies, Denmark, for instance, or at least until recently, the Scandinavian countries tend to fare a great deal better. One country that I obviously, and I'm sure you do too, have in mind is Israel, which used to be, and in some ways is, a high trust society. You see it from, people still hitchhiking on roads and helping each other out in emergencies, but seems to have moved to become a much lower trust society, particularly in the last 2 years with the fight over the judicial reform, and now questions about the ceasefire. Can I press you, if you don't mind, talking about this a little bit, about Israel and how you see the trust crisis, if it is a crisis, unfolding there, and how it differs from the crisis we see here in the United States?
I think it's a very interesting subject, actually, because trust in American life, because we are such a vast and diverse society, our trust really is often mediated by institutions. And so our trust is as strong as our institutions are, our political institutions and others. And we do have pretty strong institutions, and Americans are a relatively high trust society given how diverse we are and how massive this country is. Trust in Israel is very interesting in this sense. It has what we lack and it lacks what we have. Israel doesn't have strong institutions, political institutions especially, but in general. But Israel has very, very high levels of solidarity, or at least it has generally. And trust in Israel is very often rooted in solidarity, in a sense that we are one, we are in this together, we take care of each other. That can be a very, very powerful source of trust, and a source of a kind of trust that's extremely rare in free societies in the modern era. But it is very vulnerable. When we have a decline in social solidarity in the United States, we still have strong institutions to fall back on, and we really do. And there are rules, and we can count on them. When there are disputes about how power should be used, we actually have a very clear arrangement of institutions for addressing those. In Israel, when solidarity declines, there's no floor. There's nothing else. Now, Israel still has very high solidarity, much more so than we do, more than most European societies. And so it's a very functional country, and it's making its way through an extremely difficult year of crisis in ways that are very admirable. But the fight over the court reform that was dominating the news before October 7th of last year raised for me very grave concerns about what things would look like in Israel if that fundamental solidarity were to plummet to levels that are more like ours or more like the United Kingdom. These are functional societies, but they have strong institutions. How would Israel do if it had to contend with that kind of fundamental partisanship? I think Israel would be in some serious trouble, and that is an argument for building stronger institutions in Israeli society. I think a lot of Israelis are aware of the need to do that, but obviously it's much easier said than done.
It is probably easier to build or refashion institutions from the basis of social solidarity than it is to create social solidarity, even when you have well-functioning institutions. One of the things you mentioned in your essay is, it simply won't do to say, let's try to go back to the 1950s, right? I mean, they weren't as great as we now romanticize them as being. B, they were, as you've noted, the product of an epic and disastrous and tragic Second World War. So what then becomes the path forward for creating new forms of social solidarity, really at any level in the United States? And can this be done sort of in spite of the institutions, or in some organic way that doesn't require acts of government or more partisan unity than we have now?
Yeah, I don't think we can go back to the 1950s, and I don't think we should want to. There's always this irony in conversations among kind of communitarian thinkers in political science and sociology that all the periods in American history that have seemed strong in the terms that we study followed in the wake of terrible catastrophe, of war, of depression. And so the only way forward is to hope for a terrible catastrophe, and nobody wants to hope for a terrible catastrophe. That's not what we should want, and there's no guarantee that we would respond well to such a crisis anyway. And so the challenge for us, I think, does involve making more evident to ourselves, more visible, more comprehensible in our cultural vocabulary, the importance of institutions. That's very hard to do. Institutions are dry and dull. Americans in particular tend to want to ignore them when we can. We love treating them as invisible. And when they're strong, that's great. That lets us feel even more free than we really are. But when they're weak, we struggle to name the problems we have. And I think that's happening now in American life. Americans are generally aware that something's wrong, that there's a palpable sense of alienation and mistrust. We call it loneliness, we call it isolation. But I think a lot of what it really describes is, in fact, the weakening of institutions. And that requires us to think concretely about institutions, right? What really is an institution? If you ask yourself, who are the 10 people that I know best in my life? I'd ask you, how do you know those people? And the answer is family and work and school and church. Those are institutions. Institutions are collections of people that shape us by giving us a role in the pursuit of a common goal, of collective action. And we have to do a better job of seeing that we are part of institutions everywhere we go in our lives, and asking ourselves, what is the role that I have in this particular institution? What's my role in the family? And let that role shape how you behave, right? We all do this. You're driving on the highway and somebody cuts you off and you want to yell what you think about them. But if your kids are in the back of the car, you're not going to do that, or at least maybe not. You'll think, well, I actually have a role here for these people, and I'm not just going to do whatever I want. We should be able to think that way about the various roles we have in our lives, and do just a little bit better job of asking ourselves in moments of decision, given my role here, how should I behave? Now, that sounds very small, but if more of us did that, if more of our leaders did that, if more people who now incline to a kind of acidic populism did that, I think we would find that we have a little bit more room to build trust and confidence in one another. And it's that kind of incremental change that it seems to me is the only way forward. I don't think that this can be achieved by public policy. And I don't think we're going to have the kind of cultural revolution that would be required to do it in a big way from the top down.
I'm looking at the questions from the audience, and I see David Wolpe thought of the question I asked you before I asked it, which is typical of David. He's always a step ahead. A step ahead of me. So I think you've addressed this question about greater transparency in the role of eroding trust. Although I would add one point, which is that we are now in an era of, I think, a really serious and sustained reaction against some of the technologies that permit greater transparency, because we've come to notice in a very personal way their ill effects. Yeah. So people are walking away from many forms of social media. I noticed in my own institution, it used to be that we were sort of encouraged to be, I don't want to say extremely online, but quite online. Now the new policy is to take a step back. I've always thought that we would always be well served by never televising Congress, the court proceedings, or many other kind of public functions to create a kind of an aura of mystery or distance.
Yeah, I think that's true. But Brett, there's something distinct, I think, about social media in relation to what we've been talking about, which is that it actively confuses the public and the private, and therefore confuses us about what kind of institution, what kind of space we're operating in. And in that way, I think is particularly damaging to public trust and to mutual trust in one another. It leads us to behave as though we are among our friends when we are in fact in public. And that really undermines our ability to just have a sense of what's required of us in different situations. Social media is very, very confusing in those terms.
Deborah Ruth asked a question about Netanyahu, but I think we've addressed that question. But let me go to Don Shapiro's question. And Deborah, if you feel like we didn't quite address the question, just ask another question in the chat. Don Shapiro says that the loss of trust in government in the 70s era could be attributed to Watergate. Do you feel the current loss of trust has very different sources? You hinted that the answer is yes, that there's something different occurred in this century than in the previous one. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think there is a difference. I would say Watergate is as much a symptom of that loss as it was a cause of it. That decline in trust had been going on for a long time. By 1973 and 4, the period from about 67 until 75 was really a period of collapsing trust and collapsing order in American life. I think of that time as a kind of disillusionment where there genuinely was too much confidence in American leaders and institutions, and the loss of that was affected by there having been too much of it, so that there was an illusion and a disillusionment. And the 1970s as a period in our culture have that sense, that feeling to them. There was some restoration of confidence in the country in the 1980s and 90s. And some modest restoration of trust in institutions. I think the most interesting institution in that period is the one that gained public trust significantly between the 1970s and 2000, and that was the US military. The military very consciously worked on rebuilding public trust, and it did it not by demonstrating that it could win wars. It won some and didn't win some in that period, and in the 21st century. It did it by demonstrating that it was formative of the people within it, that to be a Marine is to be a certain kind of human being, that to be in the Army is to be a particularly trustworthy sort of American. And if you look at the way in which the United States military presented itself to the country in the period after the end of the draft, it's really an extraordinary study in how an institution can build some public trust in itself. And some of what and by the way, that trust persists. The military is less trusted now than it was in 2000, but it's more trusted than just about any other public institution. What we've seen in the 21st century, I think, does have to do with more of a breakdown in institutional roles and institutional integrity along the lines we've been talking about. So these things are obviously related, but I think they can be distinguished from each
other. Let's take a look. Someone who I hope is not a chatbot, because it's Samsung SMT970, asks, what is the gap between perception and reality in the behavior of an institution?
That's a very interesting question. So even if it is a chatbot, that's a good question. I think institutions have to worry about how they're perceived, and they also have to worry about how they actually function. These aren't the same thing. And to be self-conscious about how you're perceived, I do think does help an institution take its responsibility more seriously. Now, there's a way to do this cynically and just be and just be completely untrustworthy, but put on a show. But that's actually very difficult to do. And to sustain that level of cynicism at an institutional level for a long time isn't really all that easy. I would say I follow the logic of Aristotle's ethics here, which argues in essence that the best way to become a good person is to ask yourself, what would a good person do? And then do that. And in a sense, that's pretending to be a good person. But okay, good enough. That's often the best that any of us can do. And I think to strive for a certain type of behavior, even if the reason we do it is so that we are perceived as behaving that way, is a step in the right direction. So I would encourage institutions to care a lot about how they're perceived and whether they're trusted. And ultimately, the best way to be trusted is to be trustworthy. And so it won't work unless there's some element of reality to it.
By the way, for the record, Samsung SMT970 is a real person named Barbara. She just wanted to make that clear. Excellent question, Barbara. Stephen Russick asks a question: how has the evolution of media towards a more partisan media in the last 30 years contributed to the loss of trust being discussed today?
Yeah, I would say that there's a broader evolution that's been part of an evolution of our culture and our politics, um, from an emphasis on broad appeal, where the business model of the media was a kind of classified ad model, where you want the largest number of people, of different kinds of people, to read your product, and so what you produce has the broadest possible appeal. Similarly, the political parties obviously want to have the broadest possible coalition, and so they want to appeal to something like the middle of the country to the extent they can, and they fight over owning that middle. What we've seen over the last 30 years or so, in both respects and in many others too, is a kind of personalization of the business model that leads in the opposite direction. So now for media, the classified ad model doesn't exist, and the way to make money in journalism is to have an intense following, even though it would be a narrow following. You want them to keep coming back, and so you want to keep them interested, which means you want to give them what they want over and over and over. And very often, that is anger, that is fear, and the incentives to provide that instead of providing a broadly appealing mode of information is very strong. The same is true in our political life, where the dominance of the primaries now in candidate selection in our politics means that the people you're appealing to are actually the people who are already most intensely devoted to you. That's your audience. You're not really trying to win the people who could go either way. And that means, again, your incentive is performative. Your incentive is to yield intense devotion rather than broad devotion. I think that transformation of how people think about what it means to succeed in American life, in business, in culture, in politics, is really a big part of the story of the 21st century. And it does have a lot to do with why trust is harder to come by.
Well, it also seems to me that there was once a concept of authority that perhaps emerges from more hierarchical structures in American life, an idea that leaders earn a certain place and position, so that when Walter Cronkite would say, and that's the way it was this day, I don't know, August 22nd, 1965, Americans believed him because they believed that authority had a lot to recommend it, and that facts should shape opinions rather than opinions shaping facts. Now, of course, as we now know, Cronkite was as anyone else, but there was an idea of authority in American media that has been substituted with an idea that the consumer is always right. And so what we are individual taste, this idea that the consumer is always right, which used to apply to taste, now applies to just about everything. And how you go back, how you restore a concept of authority throughout institutions is the great question. Obviously, you're providing, I think, a lot of the answer here. You know, it's if you want to be like Aristotle, if you want to be trusted, be trustworthy, right?
Yeah, and look, I think that's a very important piece of the story, and it's very important to see that the kind of confidence you describe, for example, in American journalism, was built up. It didn't always exist, and it has been lost, but it was actually created. If you look at American journalism in the 18th century, it looks much more like it does in the 21st century than it did in the 20th, right? There was a period of professionalization when things like schools of journalism started to appear. There was nothing like that before. American newspapers were very partisan at the beginning of the 19th century. You know, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette is called that because it was founded by the Democratic Party. And it was a party organ, and that was true of a lot of state-level newspapers in the United States. And then over time, gradually, there was a kind of professionalization that built up a certain sort of confidence. That would be very hard to do now, but I don't think we should treat it as impossible. I think we should ask ourselves what sources of confidence might look like in our time that are somehow analogous to what they looked like in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, when a lot of confidence was built up in a lot of institutions. Social capital is not just something you spend, it is also something you can amass if you work at it.
Well, one thing, and I'm just going to add this briefly, get to Elaine Langer's question, is that there are some media institutions where if you belong to that institution, your role is to serve the institution. There are other media institutions where the institution lives to serve at least its celebrity, star hosts, anchors, and so on. I think one of the reasons The Economist magazine has defied the trend of most news magazines is that they don't have bylines. They have no interest in having star columnists, star reporters. When you read something in The Economist, the author is The Economist. It's the institution itself, and I think it's one of the reasons that publication has managed to retain the trust of a lot of its readers. Elaine Langer raises an interesting question here. She says, do you think that there really is less diversity among groups of elites, quote unquote elites, at this time, or is there a fear of speaking out because of the dominant cancel culture? Do you think that if the populace were as much in control of the media and big tech platforms, they would go to the lengths that our woke cultural elites have gone to censor opposing opinions and facts?
Well, I think that question, the way in which it's framed, and it's a very good question, already offers some evidence that we have a much more cohesive elite than we used to in the United States, because that question can apply across our culture. It can apply to Hollywood studios and to the tech companies and to journalism and to politics and to higher education. These actually used to be much more distinct sectors of American life. An English professor used to be a very, very different human being than a CEO of a bank. That's just less true now than it was in 19th century America, much less true. And those people are likely to have gone through the same school. They're likely to have the same basic cultural predilections and dispositions. That fact matters a lot. And it means that there's also a cohesive counter elite in a lot of these institutions, dissenting professionals. I work at a conservative think tank. It's a building full of dissenting professionals, people who ought to be teaching at Yale, but aren't for this fundamentally cultural reason, and they know it. And so they define themselves against that dominant elite, but they are an elite themselves. So I do think that's now a very important dynamic in American public life, but that it is a function in some important ways of our country having a much more cohesive and almost single elite class, more like 19th century England than 19th century America.
Sanford Kessler asks, what accounts for the high level of trust in former President Trump in large parts of our population? Why is a guy who the elites think is a compulsive liar, and there's a fair amount of evidence to back that up, why does he elicit that profound sense of trust among tens of millions of Americans.
I think that Donald Trump has come to embody a lot of people's resentment of the American elite. And so the fact that he is as hated as he is by the people they don't like is why he is as loved as he is by his admirers. And that's almost independent of anything that he actually says and does. He sort of stands in for an attitude in a way that I think exceeds anything I've seen in my adult life in our politics. And he knows it. You know, when he says that he could just shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, as he did 6 or 7 years ago, he said, I should say, he understands his situation pretty well. That's right. And I think part of the reason for that is that by embodying in the figure of a single human being the intense mistrust that some Americans have of our core institutions and the people who run them, he allows himself to just stand in for that, almost regardless of what specifically he says and does. That's what happens in a populist moment. In a populist moment, political leaders come to stand in for public attitudes rather than to actually function as individuals in our public life. I think it's a very dangerous thing. And I think that we see that in a lot of the effects that Trump has had on our political culture. But it's a reaction. It's a populist reaction to a certain kind of attitude about the American elite. And yeah, I think it gives Trump a peculiar kind of immunity.
Well, one might also say that Trump externalizes his mendacity, but many of the institutions that he opposes internalize theirs. And so there's a sense that he is more honest, even in his lies, than institutions that parade as one thing and behave in another way.
And he turns his critics into what he says they are. I mean,
yeah.
I think the extraordinary thing is that almost everything that Trump's critics say about him is true. Almost everything that he says about them is true.
Yeah.
And they're a reaction to each other in that way.
Stanley Spatz asks, if trust is stronger at the local levels, is that not an argument for decentralizing our political system and political power? I suspect I know your answer, but go ahead.
Yeah, you're certainly speaking my language with that. I'm a big believer in decentralization, in federalism, in the notion that America functions best when it functions from the bottom up. Most of the governing we do in our country still does happen at the state level, or at least at the state and local level. I think we've seen a kind of nationalization of state and local politics. I mean, there are people in my county running for county commission on an immigration agenda this year, but they have absolutely no control over immigration, but they want to send a message about who they are by playing to national issues. I think that's very detrimental to good government in America, and then ultimately more decentralization would be very good for us.
Yuval, I really want to thank you for spending this hour with our very devoted group of SAPIR Zoomers. I think I was talking about you behind your back. I was talking about you with, I can't remember who, but they described you as the Irving Kristol of our generation. And I think that was meant as a compliment. It is a compliment. You are that. I always learn from reading you in national affairs, and you have a luminous essay in Commentary Magazine coming up about the Academy. It's a great honor to have you in the pages of SAPIR, and I hope we can invite you back for a follow-on essay.
Well, thank you very much, Bret. I could never fill the shoes of Irving Kristol, but I appreciate that compliment, and it's a great privilege to be speaking with you. I'm a great admirer of yours, so thank you so much.
And thanks to everyone who joined us for this call. We'll see you the next time.